Japan, autumn of 1945. The war is over, but the air still smells of smoke and defeat. Inside a former Imperial Army compound near Yokohama, the silence is sharp enough to cut through the air. Rows of Japanese women officers, once symbols of discipline and devotion, sit rigidly on wooden benches. Their uniforms are gone, replaced by plain gray garments issued by the occupiers. A faint click echoes from the far corner. An American soldier adjusts a film projector, its beam cutting through the dim hall. Dust floats in the light like drifting ash. The women look up, uncertain, as moving shadows flicker onto a white sheet. It isn't a propaganda film or an interrogation session. It's an American movie. Music, laughter, color, and faces unmasked by war. Some of the women exchange wary glances. Others stare, motionless. For years, emotion had been a weakness, and now it was suddenly allowed. In that moment, under the trembling light of the projector, Japan's military silence met America's cultural voice. The summer of 1945 had brought Japan to its knees. After years of unrelenting warfare across Asia and the Pacific, the empire that once dreamed of eternal expansion now faced ruin. Cities lay in ashes, industries silent, and the people, both soldiers and civilians, were broken in body and spirit. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice, soft and distant, echoed through crackling radios across the nation. For the first time, his people heard him speak, not to command, but to surrender. His words, carefully chosen, carried the weight of an entire nation's defeat. The "endure the unendurable" speech marked not only the close of a war, but the collapse of an entire ideology. In the following weeks, American forces arrived, not as raiders, but as rulers. Led by General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers, the occupation of Japan began with precision and purpose. Unlike the vengeance that many expected, the mission was built on something far more calculated: reconstruction. By September 1945, U.S. soldiers had established command posts in Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, and beyond. The streets were crowded with civilians scavenging for food. American jeeps rolled past the remnants of the Imperial Army, now stripped of authority. But in hidden corners of the country, one group remained largely invisible in the chaos: the women officers of Japan's wartime institutions. They had served in the Women's Volunteer Corps, the Army nurses, and administrative divisions supporting the imperial military machine. They had been taught that the emperor was divine, that surrender was dishonor, and that the West was corrupt. Many of them had trained in hospitals near the front lines, witnessed death up close, and memorized the codes of silence and obedience. When Japan capitulated, these women faced a double collapse of their nation and their identity. Some were detained by American forces for questioning, others placed under supervision in former military facilities. Their world of structure and discipline was replaced by uncertainty. The Americans faced a dilemma. They could not treat every Japanese uniform as an enemy, yet they also couldn't ignore the potential for hidden loyalty. So they observed, recorded, and classified. But they also did something unexpected. They began to teach. MacArthur's administration introduced sweeping reforms. The military was abolished, censorship was lifted, and education was restructured. Japanese newspapers began publishing freely under new guidelines. A constitution guaranteeing democracy and women's rights was drafted. And within the occupied territories, even prisoners of war and former officers were exposed to something Japan had long shielded them from: Western culture. To the American mind, culture was a weapon as powerful as any bomb. Instead of bullets, they used books, theater, and cinema. The idea was simple, yet revolutionary: show the defeated nation what freedom looked like. Let them see the difference between tyranny and liberty, emotion and suppression. Among the earliest cultural outreach programs, the U.S. Civil Information and Education Section, CIE, launched screenings of American films across Japan. The goal wasn't entertainment, it was transformation. The films chosen often portrayed ordinary life in democratic societies. Men and women laughing, disagreeing, loving, and living without fear of authority. When American officers suggested showing movies even to detained Japanese personnel, it was seen as radical. Why offer comfort to those who had once sworn allegiance to an enemy emperor? But to the occupation authorities, this was not mercy. It was strategy. In several re-education centers, including those near Yokohama and Tokyo, screenings were arranged under supervision. Among the audiences were former officers, men and women, who had never seen an uncensored foreign film. What they saw on screen challenged everything they had been taught to believe. For the first time, the American occupiers were not soldiers. They were narrators of another world. And for those women who had lived through the code of silence, the sight of laughter, romance, and freedom was both alien and unforgettable. That silent hall, illuminated by the flicker of a film reel, became a theater of psychological reconstruction. The war had ended, but the battle for Japan's mind had just begun. The Americans who arrived in Japan after the surrender didn't only come to occupy. They came to reshape. The mission of the Allied occupation, as directed by General MacArthur, was not revenge. It was reform. He and his staff believed Japan's militarism had been born not just from political failure, but from cultural isolation. To prevent another war, they needed to rebuild the Japanese mind. That mission had three pillars: demilitarization, democratization, and education. Under the Civil Information and Education Section, the CIE, this last pillar became a weapon of quiet power. While the Japanese army had once relied on strict censorship and propaganda to mold thought, the Americans used information, art, and especially cinema to do the opposite, to open it. To most Americans, movies were part of life: laughter on a Friday night, tears on a Sunday afternoon. But in wartime Japan, cinema had been another front of battle. Every frame was filtered through ideology. Actors bowed to the emperor on screen. Women were shown as selfless servants of the state. Emotion was duty, not expression. The CIE reversed that. They selected films from the United States that showed the freedom of ordinary citizens, people arguing with authority, choosing love, failing, laughing, and rebuilding. Among these films were Gone with the Wind, The Best Years of Our Lives, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The choice was deliberate. Each story carried the moral tone of democracy, the humanity of defeat, and the possibility of renewal. In late 1945, American officers proposed an experiment, screening these films for select groups of former officers and educated personnel, including women who had served the Imperial Army. The idea was met with skepticism from both sides. Some American soldiers felt it was too soon, that the wounds of war were still fresh. The Japanese administrators assisting the occupation feared that humiliation might deepen resentment. But MacArthur approved the experiment. He believed, as he once wrote, that the only lasting victories are won in the hearts of men. And so, in the cold months following Japan's surrender, makeshift theaters were created inside barracks, schools, and auditoriums across occupied Japan. The equipment came from U.S. Army stockpiles. Generators hummed. Screens were hung from walls once covered with military flags. The same rooms that had echoed with war speeches now filled with music, laughter, and the dialogue of a foreign language. For many Japanese officers, particularly the women, This was their first encounter with unrestricted Western culture. The experience was jarring. They had been raised in a system that glorified sacrifice and condemned emotional expression as weakness. Yet here, in front of them, were American women walking freely, smiling, arguing with men, and living without fear. It was more than entertainment. It was revelation. Reports from the Civil Information and Education section recorded these reactions in subdued language. Subjects displayed quiet astonishment, one noted. Several participants appeared deeply moved. Behind those words was a moment of profound cultural shock. These women had served an empire that banned even the mention of surrender. Now they watched a world where freedom meant disagreement, and peace meant individuality. Outside the screening halls, Japan was changing rapidly. American authorities oversaw the drafting of a new constitution that granted women the right to vote for the first time. Schools were rebuilt, textbooks rewritten. The emperor renounced his divinity, standing not as a god, but as a man before his people. The screenings of American films fit perfectly into this wider transformation. They were not just propaganda. They were psychological therapy for a defeated nation. The United States wanted to rebuild Japan not through force, but through fascination. If Japanese citizens could admire the ideals behind American culture, they would embrace democracy not as a command, but as a choice. In that delicate balance between pride and humility, one event stood out: the day when a group of former Japanese women officers were quietly invited to watch an American film. They entered the hall with suspicion, sat in silence, and saw their world reflected and contradicted on a glowing screen. It was not just a screening. It was the beginning of Japan's emotional reconstruction. The projector's light didn't just illuminate the wall, it revealed a new direction, a future no longer written by military orders, but by the simple human power of seeing. In that dim hall where the hum of the projector filled the air, every woman watching brought with her a different war. Their uniforms had vanished, but their memories had not. The film before them, an American production filled with color, laughter, and casual freedom, was more than entertainment. It was confrontation. Each frame collided with the beliefs that had shaped their lives. 1. The human angle. These women had once stood at the heart of an empire that demanded silence. They had memorized obedience. Their expressions, even their gestures, had been regulated by code. Many of them were educated, disciplined, and fiercely loyal. They had served in hospitals, logistics offices, and recruitment bureaus, each convinced their sacrifice was for eternal Japan. Now, seated under the dim glow of a foreign projector, they faced a flood of emotions long suppressed. In the flickering images of American families embracing and lovers laughing, they saw something forbidden: human vulnerability without punishment. For years, they had believed emotion weakened the nation. Now they watched it strengthen the people on screen. Some sat motionless, fighting tears. Others studied the faces of the Americans seated nearby, trying to decode what sort of enemy could produce such stories. Shame mixed with awe. The idea that the same nation which had unleashed firebombs upon Tokyo could also create something so tender was almost incomprehensible. This wasn't propaganda. It was humanity. And for those who had given their youth to the rigidity of war, that realization was almost unbearable. 2. The cultural angle. For centuries, Japanese culture had drawn strength from formality, ritual, hierarchy, discipline. Even in art, expression was subtle, symbolic, contained. But Hollywood offered no such restraint. It was bold, emotional, impulsive. Women argued with men, soldiers cried, children laughed at authority. To the Japanese women officers, These scenes were unthinkable during wartime. They had been raised to believe that the West was corrupt, indulgent, lacking honor. Yet, before their eyes, that corruption looked strangely alive. In one screening, a romantic scene drew gasps. A man and woman held hands openly. A few whispered among themselves, scandalized. Yet something inside them stirred, a question they dared not voice. Was this weakness, or was this freedom? The Americans, watching from the back of the room, said little. They didn't need to. The film spoke louder than any lecture. After the screening, some women later admitted they couldn't sleep that night. The laughter in the film echoed in their minds. It was the sound of something they had never truly known: permission to feel. Cultural historians would later describe this moment as emotional disarmament. Just as Japan had surrendered its weapons, it was now surrendering its emotional armor. Through cinema, the rigid mask of wartime identity began to crack. In Tokyo, the CIE recorded an observation. The visual impact of Western emotional openness produced effects not achievable through written instruction. It was a bureaucratic way of saying what everyone in that room had already felt. The power of art could reach places no order ever could. The Americans didn't know it yet, but these screenings would leave a quiet scar on Japan's collective memory. They would reshape the way a generation saw itself, not as subjects of a fallen empire, but as individuals capable of choice. And it began with a film reel turning in the dark. The light faded, the projector clicked to silence, and the women sat still long after the final scene. The American soldiers began packing up the equipment, but the mood in the room lingered, a silence no longer of fear, but of thought. What began as a psychological experiment was becoming something deeper: the unspoken realization that the enemy's humanity mirrored their own. 3. The tactical, psychological angle. To understand why Americans allowed these screenings, one must step into the mindset of post-war strategists. The occupation of Japan was, in itself, a military campaign. One fought not with tanks and artillery, but with ideas. The American command understood that permanent peace could not be imposed by force. It had to be planted in the mind. The Civil Information and Education Section, CIE, was the spearhead of that effort. Its officers were not generals but teachers, journalists, and filmmakers. They had studied Japan's wartime propaganda machine and understood how deeply ideology had penetrated the nation's psyche. The emperor was divine, obedience sacred, individuality dangerous. To dismantle that conditioning, America needed a softer weapon, a way to make freedom appear not foreign, but desirable. Cinema became that weapon. When those projectors flickered to life in detention halls and public theaters, the goal wasn't mere entertainment. Each film was a psychological campaign disguised as art. The Americans called it cultural democratization. The process was simple: replace the emotional void of militarism with the fullness of human experience. Show that life could exist beyond command and conquest. Every reaction was studied. CIE officers took notes: how the audience responded to laughter, romance, and vulnerability. They weren't mocking the Japanese. They were measuring the slow dismantling of fear. When a former women's officer smiled at a scene of reconciliation, it was, in the eyes of occupation psychologists, a small victory. They knew that a mind opened by curiosity could never again be fully closed by ideology. The screenings also served a diplomatic purpose. America wanted to rebuild Japan as an ally against Soviet influence in Asia. For that to happen, the two nations needed a bridge, not of politics, but of emotion. Film was that bridge. The idea was to let admiration replace resentment, to let fascination erode hostility. In this way, a projector became as strategic as a battleship. 4. The moral, historical angle. History would later remember Japan's occupation as one of the most peaceful reconstructions in modern times. But beneath the statistics and treaties lay something far more human, a moral struggle for identity. For the Japanese women officers, watching those American films was not simply about defeat or curiosity. It was about rediscovery. Many of them had lost families in air raids, watched comrades die for an emperor they could no longer serve, and survived only to face shame. Yet here they were, being treated not as prisoners, but as students. Their captors had given them something no military ever had: the chance to imagine. In that gift lay the quiet, moral victory of the occupation. America had chosen empathy over humiliation. The screenings symbolized that choice. Instead of reinforcing hatred, they invited understanding. The women were not told what to think. They were allowed to feel. This was the moral inversion of war. During battle, both nations had dehumanized each other to survive. Now, peace demanded the opposite: to humanize the enemy, to rebuild. In later years, Japanese writers and historians would recall those screenings with complex emotion. Some saw them as cultural colonization, an invasion through art. Others described them as liberation, the moment when Japan began to see itself not as defeated, but as renewed. Both views were true. The films did not erase the pain of Hiroshima or the memory of Tokyo's ashes, but they introduced something new into the national psyche: reflection. For the first time in decades, Japan was looking inward, not outward. Among the women officers, this transformation was particularly profound. Many later became teachers, nurses, or community leaders during Japan's reconstruction. Some even admitted, years later, that those films had been their first glimpse of the world beyond command. Their stunned silence during that first screening was not weakness. It was awakening. The light that had once burned their cities was now illuminating a path toward something they had never known: peace with themselves. When the reels finally stopped turning and the American officers packed up their equipment, no one in that room could have imagined that they had just witnessed a small but historic moment. The seeds planted that day would grow quietly, shaping the identity of post-war Japan in ways no soldier, no general, could have predicted. And as the women officers stepped out of the hall into the gray morning air, one thought lingered among them: the realization that power could exist not in silence, but in emotion. That revelation, unexpected, profound, and disarming, would mark the beginning of Japan's transformation from an empire of obedience to a nation of reflection. It was a cold morning in late 1945 when the order came. A small group of Japanese women officers, former members of the Imperial Army's auxiliary units, were to report to a hall inside a U.S.-controlled compound in Yokohama. They arrived in silence, escorted by military guards who spoke a language they barely understood. Their faces were calm, expressionless, the way they had been trained. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of gasoline and dust. The chairs were lined in neat rows. A white sheet hung against the far wall. To most of them, it looked like preparation for a briefing or interrogation. Instead, an American sergeant carried in a film projector. Another man set up a small loudspeaker. There was confusion among the women. Some whispered questions in soft voices. Others simply stared. An officer explained, through a translator, that they would be shown a motion picture. The announcement drew more silence than surprise. The concept itself was foreign. A film not meant for propaganda, not ordered by the government, but chosen by their conquerors. When the lights dimmed, a low mechanical hum filled the room. The projector sputtered. flickered, and then, suddenly, light exploded onto the sheet. The movie was Gone with the Wind. It had been banned in wartime Japan as Western decadence, but now it was chosen precisely for what it represented: emotion, loss, survival, and the rebuilding of a world after destruction. From the opening sequence, the women were transfixed. The sweeping orchestral music filled the hall, so unlike the rigid military marches they once knew. Scarlett O'Hara appeared, defiant, proud, flawed, human. She was everything the Imperial Code discouraged in women, yet everything the Americans now wanted Japan to see: individuality, choice, resilience. When the scene came where the city burned, several of the women gasped quietly. The flames on screen reflected memories of their own. The night Tokyo burned under the American firebombs. For a moment, cinema and reality fused. The women were not just watching history, they were reliving it. As the film went on, laughter echoed softly from the American officers standing near the back. The women didn't join them. Their silence was not indifference. It was defense. Inside, a quiet storm raged. Every smile, every gesture on screen challenged their understanding of honor. Halfway through the film, the projector jammed. The reel stopped, the light froze, and for a brief second, the illusion broke. In that silence, one woman, an officer who had served in a medical corps in Manila, whispered something in Japanese. Her companion beside her glanced over, startled. It was only 2 words. Subarashi Sekai. What a beautiful world. It was not said with admiration, but with disbelief. To her, the freedom of these characters seemed unreal, impossible. Yet the longing in her voice betrayed something deeper, a yearning for what she had never known. When the reel resumed, the audience stayed fixed, as if afraid to blink. The emotions on screen grew heavier: love, betrayal, despair, endurance. For women who had been taught that feeling was weakness, this was a revelation that pain could coexist with dignity. By the time the film reached its famous final line, "After all, tomorrow is another day," many sat frozen, unable to look away. The phrase, delivered by a foreign actress across an ocean of difference, landed like a whisper of prophecy. Tomorrow was another day, for them, for Japan, for the entire idea of what life after war could mean. When the lights came back on, no one moved. The Americans waited, uneasy, expecting perhaps applause, perhaps hostility. None came, only a heavy, fragile quiet. Finally, an American officer stepped forward and thanked them for their attention. His words were translated, but few seemed to hear. The women officers rose, bowed slightly, and walked out into the cold air. Outside, the world felt both familiar and alien. Smoke still drifted from the ruins of Yokohama, but somewhere in that silence a seed had been planted. They had seen the enemy's heart, and it had looked human. That day, the war ended again, not on a battlefield, but in a dark room where light flickered across faces once hardened by obedience. The film reels turned that morning into a quiet revolution. The occupation officials recorded the event as a psychological demonstration. They never knew that for those women, it was something far greater. A moment when surrender transformed into awakening. In the days that followed that screening in Yokohama, something subtle began to shift. No formal orders were given, no reports filed. But among the women who had been there, a quiet current of change ran beneath the surface. The Japanese press did not cover it. Occupation censorship still limited what could be printed, but word spread quietly among officers and civil staff. The Americans had shown them a movie. It sounded trivial, almost absurd in a nation still struggling to find food and shelter. Yet to those who had witnessed it, it was not the movie itself that lingered, but what it represented. For the first time, they had seen power without fear. The contrast was jarring. Under the old order, obedience had been everything. Emotions were dangerous. Compassion was distraction. To question command was to betray one's country. Yet the film they had watched portrayed strength born from vulnerability, courage built on human imperfection. And that was the most powerful message of all. Some of the women, once high-ranking officers in nursing and logistics divisions, were later questioned by American cultural officers for feedback. Their responses were cautious. They spoke politely, formally, avoiding open criticism. Yet between their words lay a trace of transformation. One officer described the experience as seeing the world through unshuttered eyes. Another said it was strange to feel something and not be punished. The Americans took note. The CIE expanded its cultural re-education programs. Screenings spread beyond Yokohama to Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. By 1946, American films were being shown in schools, universities, and even small community halls. The occupation authorities began to realize that the real reconstruction of Japan would not happen in parliament buildings or military tribunals. It would happen in classrooms, theaters, and homes. Inside those spaces, Japan's next chapter was quietly being written. Meanwhile, among the women officers, the change deepened. Some of them volunteered for new civilian training programs. A few joined translation teams or became instructors for health and welfare under the American supervised reforms. They were no longer soldiers, but they were beginning to see themselves as something even more powerful: citizens. For many, the most haunting image of that film was not the burning city or the famous closing line. It was the simple act of a woman standing up for herself. To them, it symbolized survival through selfhood, an idea long suppressed under imperial doctrine. Japan's new constitution, drafted under American guidance and enacted in 1947, would soon enshrine women's equality as law. But before it was written, it had already been felt. In that hall, in that screening, in that stunned silence. Cultural historians later traced the symbolic importance of that moment. They called it the first unguarded gaze. It was the instant when Japanese society, stripped of propaganda and hierarchy, looked directly into the emotional world of its former enemy and saw not corruption, but humanity. It did not mean instant acceptance. Pride still burned beneath the surface. Many officers refused to speak of that day for years. To admit they had been moved by American cinema felt like betrayal. Yet even in silence, the shift persisted. The image of light dancing on the wall had imprinted something that no ideology could erase. In the archives of the Civil Information and Education section, one report from early 1946 stands out. It reads, "Among female officers and staff exposed to Western cultural content, notable reductions in hostility were observed. Subjects display increased curiosity, emotional openness, and adaptive reasoning toward democratic ideals." In the language of bureaucracy, this was a quiet triumph. The very people once trained to reject American influence were now experiencing its human appeal. Years later, when Japan began its rapid economic rise, cultural critics would look back and trace part of that transformation to these early encounters. The screenings, lectures, and art exhibitions conducted by the occupation had not simply re-educated Japan, they had reintroduced imagination. In a war that had killed millions, it was not a bomb, not a treaty, but a movie projector that symbolized rebirth. For those women, the sound of the reel spinning became a memory more vivid than the thunder of guns. It represented the moment when the walls of ideology cracked and the first light of choice entered. As one former officer wrote decades later in her memoir, "We did not cry when Japan surrendered. We cried when we saw that film, because for the first time, we realized that life could continue." That was the true turning point, not just for them, but for an entire nation learning to live again. The projector had been turned off, but the light it cast endured. In art, in law, and in the hearts of those who witnessed it. The next chapter would be written not in darkness, but in reflection. Japan's aftermath of transformation. By the spring of 1947, Japan's streets had begun to breathe again. Markets reopened. Schoolyards echoed with children's laughter, fragile but persistent. The rubble still stood as a reminder, but green shoots pressed through cracks in the concrete. For the first time in years, life was reclaiming the ruins. Yet beneath the surface, something deeper was happening. The transformation of Japan was not just political or economic, it was emotional. The silent discipline that had defined the empire was giving way to curiosity, expression, and vulnerability. For the women who had once served in uniform, this new world was both liberating and disorienting. Many of them, stripped of rank and authority, struggled to find purpose in civilian life. Yet within that uncertainty lay a strange kind of freedom, the freedom to choose. Some returned to their hometowns, where rice paddies replaced parade grounds. Others joined reconstruction efforts as teachers, clerks, or translators for the occupying forces. They carried with them not the pride of soldiers, but the quiet resolve of survivors. Among them was a small group from the Yokohama screening, those who had once sat together in that dim hall. They stayed in touch through handwritten letters, exchanging stories of their new lives. One of them described watching another American film in Tokyo, this time voluntarily. Another wrote that she had begun teaching English to local children, saying she wanted them to understand the language of peace before they ever hear the language of war. Their correspondence became a mirror of Japan's transformation, hesitant, emotional, searching for identity. The American occupation, for all its controversies, had introduced something Japan had never known in such scale: cultural freedom. Theaters filled with laughter again. Music drifted from radio sets, jazz, swing, the rhythms of an unfamiliar optimism. For younger generations, America was no longer the enemy. It was a symbol of modernity. Still, not everyone welcomed the change. Many older citizens viewed the rapid westernization with suspicion. Temples that had survived the bombings now stood beside cinemas showing foreign films. Schools replaced imperial edicts with lessons on democracy and debate. It was as if the entire nation were waking from a long, rigid dream, and not everyone liked what they saw. For the women of the former imperial army, this inner conflict was especially sharp. They had been taught to suppress emotion, to serve without question. Now they were being asked to think, feel, and even disagree. Some adapted quickly, others withdrew into silence. Yet all of them carried a shared understanding that Japan's soul had been forced to confront its reflection in the mirror of defeat. And from that reflection emerged something unexpected: empathy. For decades, Japan's national identity had been built upon the idea of collective strength. Why? Harmony through obedience. But in the ashes of war, harmony began to mean something else: the coexistence of difference, the acceptance of imperfection. By the time the new Constitution took effect, granting women equal rights and freedom of speech, a quiet revolution had already taken place in the hearts of many. The women who had seen that first American film knew instinctively that change did not come from laws alone. It came from imagination. In 1948, one of them, now working as a librarian in Osaka, organized a small film club. It was nothing grand, just a weekly gathering in a rebuilt community hall where villagers watched both Japanese and Western films. They discussed stories, characters, emotions. To an outsider, it seemed simple entertainment. But to her, it was education through empathy, the same lesson she had learned 2 years earlier under the flickering projector. When asked, years later, why she devoted her life to film education, she said softly, "Because I saw the war end not with silence, but with a story. That story, told through reels of light and shadow, became a quiet bridge between two worlds." America had sought to democratize Japan, but what it truly did was reawaken Japan's humanity. By the early 1950s, Japan's cultural revival was unstoppable. Writers, filmmakers, and artists emerged, blending Western techniques with Japanese sensibility. Kurosawa, Mizoguchi, and Ozu would soon redefine world cinema. Women entered universities, joined the workforce, and began writing their own narratives. The seeds planted in that post-war hall had grown into an orchard of voices. And as for those who had once worn the gray uniforms of defeat, they found themselves living in a Japan they could barely recognize, yet somehow understood more deeply than anyone else. They had seen the end of an empire and the beginning of emotion. By 1951, the occupation formally ended. American troops began to leave Japan, their flags lowered from garrison buildings, their vehicles rolling toward the ports. The once watchful eyes of the occupiers faded from the streets, but their influence lingered in ways no one could erase. For those Japanese women officers who had once sat in silence before the glow of an American film, the departure of the U.S. forces felt strangely bittersweet. They were no longer prisoners, but they were no longer soldiers either. What remained was memory, layered, conflicted, and deeply human. Some kept the small mementos they had been given during their time under American supervision. A notebook, a pen, or in one rare case, a movie ticket stub. To them, these were not signs of surrender, but symbols of transition. The war had stripped them of everything familiar, and yet through that loss, they had learned something profound, that power and compassion could coexist. The Japanese press, once tightly controlled by military censorship, began printing stories of reconciliation. Reports emerged of American soldiers helping rebuild villages or teaching English to local children. One article, published in 1950, described how a group of former women officers attended a film festival in Tokyo, featuring both Japanese and American productions. The tone was no longer defiant, but reflective. One attendee reportedly said, "When we first watched their films, we saw victory. Now, we see people." This evolution, from obedience to observation, from propaganda to perspective, defined post-war Japan's emotional recovery. In homes across the country, radios and cinemas became classrooms of modern thought. For many women, especially those once molded by the strict codes of the Imperial Army, cinema became their first safe space to feel again, to cry, to laugh, to question. The screen was no longer a battlefield, it was a mirror of shared humanity. Even in remote villages, where electricity came late, traveling projectionists brought reels of light to open fields. Children and elders alike would gather under makeshift tents to watch stories that crossed oceans. For a nation long taught to see the world through uniformed eyes, this was revelation. And so, the story of those stunned women officers was not about a single screening. It was about what that screening symbolized. It was the moment Japan's silence cracked open, allowing something fragile yet unstoppable to emerge. Empathy through cinema. By the late 1950s, Japan had reinvented itself, not by erasing its past, but by understanding it. The world now saw not a militaristic empire, but a nation of thinkers, creators, and dreamers. Its people rebuilt cities, redefined education, and revived artistry from ruins. And in that rebirth, women played an essential role. Many who had once followed orders without question were now teaching, writing, and shaping the cultural renaissance of modern Japan. The projector's light that once symbolized defeat now illuminated their own stories. Decades later, historians would look back on the American occupation with debate. Was it benevolent reform or quiet imperialism? But for those women, the memory of that first movie remained a quieter truth. It was the first time they saw the world not as enemies and allies, but as humans. And perhaps that was the real victory. The moment when war's rigid lines blurred into the shades of shared experience. Because in that hall in Yokohama, when the projector first flickered and laughter filled the air, Japan didn't just witness American cinema, it witnessed its own rebirth. History often remembers wars through their battles, the gunfire, the generals, the victories carved into stone. But the true measure of peace lies not in treaties signed or armies disbanded. It lies in the quiet moments when people, once enemies, begin to see each other again as human. In post-war Japan, that recognition did not arrive through speeches or commands. It arrived through light, flickering, fragile, and projected on a white wall in a silent hall. The women who once stood at attention for the emperor had faced a world they did not understand. Defeat had stripped them of certainty, yet in that void they found something their military code had never offered: emotion without shame. Through a foreign film, they learned what no manual of discipline could teach: the universality of feeling. Cinema became the gentle ambassador of empathy. It crossed the ruins where soldiers could not, reached hearts that diplomacy could not, and planted seeds of transformation that would outlive every occupation force. In those reels of laughter and music, Japan saw a reflection not of America, but of humanity itself, messy, flawed, yet endlessly resilient. The story of those Japanese women officers is, in truth, the story of Japan's soul rediscovering light after darkness. Their astonishment before the screen was not weakness, it was awakening. When the projector finally dimmed and the hall fell silent, something profound lingered in the air. The realization that even in defeat, understanding could triumph. And from that understanding, a new Japan was born, not forged by the sword, but shaped by the soft power of shared stories. Because sometimes, peace does not begin with a surrender. It begins with a movie.